There it is. Thank you.
I was pointed that way, not.
We got a good picture on this side of you, Dick.
I have a prayer request
Okay.
for Bob Wednesday at St. Francis. He will have a catheter put in for this new leukapheresis, and they're going to scope down to see what's in his esophagus, if it's a lesion or lymph node.
Okay.
And then Friday he starts the leukapheresis. In 4 hours he will be at the Red Cross with the blood thing, and then on Monday they'll put it back in.
Goodness. You got a tough week ahead.
They take the blood out, send it to a lab, and they treat it some way, and then
Put
the
the,
white cells are supposed to fight the cancer in my prostate.
with this
And
proven.
while they got all your blood out, what do you
Well,
do?
that's what I was going to ask.
I'm Dracula.
Sorry I asked.
Don't get too close to me.
Yeah, be careful. Wear something on your neck. Bob will be looking for blood. Well, our prayers with you on that. That's a rough day, rough time.
I'd like to share a praise.
Okay?
Well, it was a concern and now turned into a praise, I guess. But Wednesday, my son-in-law had to go undergo an emergency appendectomy. And yesterday, he was out riding his motorcycle.
Oh, my.
Oh my gosh.
It's just a little. 3 tiny little incisions. Yeah.
Goodness
It
gracious.
was one sick puppy before they.
Oh, yeah.
They can have another praise. I don't know, I had a heart cath on Thursday, and the heart was good and no obstructions of any kind. So,
Yeah.
no state.
That is great news, great news. We're glad to hear that. Thank you. I want to share another praise, a little story that Daniel told us this morning. He said Friday he went over to get a haircut. He does. He does that now and then. He went over to
whether he needs it or not.
Not as noticeable as the first one here.
yeah, he went over to Sports Clips to get a haircut, and he's sitting back here in the chair, and he and his stylist or whatever, barber, were talking about his new baby is going to be born on Monday. This was 2 days ago. And he's talking about becoming a father on Monday afternoon. And apparently some fellow in a chair down the way overheard that conversation. And he paid for Daniel's haircut and paid for a head massage and left Daniel a note.
And a tip.
Oh yeah, and he left a very generous tip in Daniel's name. And he left Daniel a note that said, "Take care of that baby. It may change the world."
Oh.
Isn't that a marvelous story? And that's
Daniel know who it was?
no,
Doesn't know who it was?
doesn't know who it was. Just somebody that overheard the conversation.
You know, I have heard quite often that people talk about sharing, they call it pay it forward, but
Yeah.
I've also heard people talking about spreading God's blessing. You know, you can pay, like when you're in a drive-through, pay for the person behind you and just tell the person to say, "God bless you," or,
Yeah.
you know, that kind of thing. And I thought, you know, that, I've had that experience. It's a wonderful experience, and you know, it's amazing because the effect that it has on people when you do that.
I'm a little suspicious, you know. I'm kind of afraid to do that because I'm afraid they'll not tell the person that I paid for. They'll just keep the people. Some people do that on the turnpike, you know. I'm going to pay for the people behind me. But how do you do that? You can't really do that because you don't know where they got on. and how much their bill is. I guess you could just leave $10 and say,
Yeah. Well,
Change.
Well, it pay for as far as it works down, you know,
yeah,
if it'll work for 3 people.
yeah, there you go. We can do it that way.
You know, the act of kindness, whether it's taken advantage of by the people that you do, you know,
Yeah.
give the money to, doesn't matter. The
Yeah, that's true.
judgment comes later.
That's true.
You know, so if it's a blessing, even though the other people
Yeah,
might have taken the money and charged them too.
yeah. That's, it's what's in your heart that what counts.
Yeah.
right.
Well, and maybe at some point, it might have a real effect on that person. Maybe they
Absolutely.
might
Yes,
have
Absolutely.
done the wrong thing then, but it might have
And
something.
on you.
Oh,
You
yeah.
know, it's always nice to be able to do something nice for someone.
Well, I'm sure Daniel's going to always remember some stranger who was impressed by the fact that Daniel was going to become a
How
father.
can you not be impressed by Daniel?
I know, isn't that true? Isn't that true?
He is awesome. Absolutely.
I saw a bumper sticker on the way into church this morning. I had to pull up and wait for the train to go by over here on Market, and the car in front of me had several bumper stickers, but the one that I liked, I wanted to get out and peel it off and bring it over and give it to Daniel. It said, do random acts of awesome. Reminded me of Daniel. Well, let's begin with prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this morning and for our opportunity to gather together as your people, to study and to grow and to know your word. Bless us in this time of fellowship and of sharing. Lord, we ask you for your presence in this hour as we look at your word. We ask for your presence to walk with us in each day ahead of us. Be with those, especially Bob, as he goes in for these tests and treatments. We thank you for such good news from Eugenia this morning, and we ask your blessing upon all of those who are facing hospitalizations and so forth this week. In Jesus' name, amen. I happened to see an obituary page the other day, and it was just a year ago, I think this week, or maybe it is next Sunday. Fred Troutman passed away last year on Sunday morning, and I think it's next Sunday would be the Sunday. It was the 19th last year. Fred Jr. died this weekend.
Do you know what happened?
Yes, I do, but Fred Jr. died in Dallas this weekend, almost exactly a year later. So he had a very troubled life, and Fred Sr. had 2 sons, and they both have had very troubled lives. It was tragic. Let's go to 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians chapter 1. We're going to finish this chapter. I want you to look at, beginning with verse 18. There are a couple of verses in this part of chapter 1 of 1 Corinthians that are such powerful verses that I hope you'll remember these verses. One of those is verse 18. For the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing. This is the verse we left off with last Sunday. The message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, to those who can't believe, to those who won't believe. But to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. If you have experienced the power of the cross in your life, you know it is the power of God it is not foolishness. It is a very powerful thing, and the cross is the symbol of that power. Every time I read this verse and some of the verses that refer to the cross, I think of a story that was shared with me several years ago. And as we went to Hayes 2 weeks ago on the bus, I saw this cross again, and it reminded me again of this story. And I've told this story before, and you've probably heard it. It's a story of the power of the cross. I was in a pastor's We Care mission. You know what a lay witness mission was or is? I guess they're still doing them. Lay witness missions, laity, lay people go to other churches to share Christ and to care for the persons of that particular church and community. The pastor's We Care mission is done not by lay persons but by pastors. A church invites a number of pastors to come in and stay for 3 or 4 days. And they stay with members of that church community to which they go. I went to Sterling, Kansas. Stayed 3 days. And each pastor is given a list of persons from that church to care for during those 3 days. You visit with them, you get to know them, you pray with them, you pray for them. There's a worship service every evening at the church, and it can be a very powerful experience. One of the couples that was on my list that week at Sterling was, and this was 30 years ago or so. They were in their mid-70s, maybe late 70s at that time, retired farmers. In fact, he had a very bad heart condition. In fact, one night in the worship service, he basically collapsed in the pew, and we had to hold up everything while an ambulance came and rushed him to Hutchinson to the ICU unit over there. She shared this story with me. It was after he had had a couple of heart attacks and very serious, and the doctors no longer would let him drive. But they loved to go to Colorado every summer. They loved to go to Colorado. And so they decided they're going to go that summer. And she would have to do all of the driving. And they went to Colorado and had a great time. They were on the way home. And those of you who went to Hayes on the bus 2 weeks ago, remember how foggy it was that morning? You couldn't see 100 feet in front of us. Very dense across I-70. Reminded me of this story especially because they were driving home and it was night, it was dark, and it was extremely foggy, very dense fog on I-70, and it was raining. And she was driving, he was in the passenger seat asleep, and she began to worry. She couldn't see anything. She couldn't see 50 feet in front of the car. And she began to worry, how will I know where to turn off to go south to Ellsworth and Sterling? I'll miss the turn. Where are we going to end up? She was really beginning to get worried about that. And he was sound asleep. She didn't want to wake him up. So she just kept driving in that dense fog and rain. And she said, at one point, I looked out the right side window, and there, just as clear as a bell, was a cross showing through the fog. And suddenly I knew a peace that I'd not known. I knew somehow we were going to get home and everything was going to be all right. We were going to be safe. And I was just as calm as could be. That cross is a good, probably quarter of a mile south of Highway 70. To be seen in that kind of fog, you couldn't see 100 feet in front of the car. But she looked out that window and she could see that cross standing out there in that little churchyard there's a little wooden church south of I-70. It's at the 213 mile mark, in case you want to look for it. Sits out there on a hill. And it's been there, I know, 40 years. They erected a cross, just a very simple cross in their front yard of that church. And it's got light bulbs on that cross that they keep lit every night across I-70. That's the power of the cross. That to me, I always remember, every time I drive across I-70, I look for that little cross. And we couldn't see it on the morning that we drove to Hayes because the fog was so dense. Shoot, we couldn't even see those big old 200-foot windmills. And there's about 300 of them out there now across I-70. We couldn't even see those in the fog. But
you didn't need the cross at that time.
no, we didn't need.
She did.
That's right. In her moment of greatest need, when she was most afraid, there it was. She said, just as clear as day, right there, out that window. And I knew everything was going to be all right. That's the power of the cross. I pointed that little church out as we were coming back from Hayes. It was not foggy coming back. And you could see for miles across I-70. You can, as you're coming back from the west, you can see that little church about 6 or 7 miles before you get to it, sitting on a hill south of I-70. It's such a cute little church sitting out there. Now they've got a wind farm all around it, and there are half a dozen or so of those huge windmills right around that little church. They look kind of eerie in the fog, let me tell you. It looks like science fiction. That's though what I want to impress on you. That's what Paul's talking about here. The power of the cross to those who are being saved. I suppose someone driving across that I-70 on that night that she was driving across, if they could have seen that cross, would it have meant anything to them? If they were atheists or non-believers, would that cross mean anything at all to them? They might think, how foolish of that little church to keep those lights burning all night and pay all those electric bills. Maybe they can tap into one of those big generators.
I was going to say, they probably are wealthier than most churches.
Yeah.
That many turbines around them.
That's true.
Maybe a witness to someone, if it turns somebody, if the cross
Yes.
turns somebody on. Maybe
Yeah.
on the other hand, it witnessed
There you go.
somebody in need.
The power of the cross. Then Paul begins to ask a series of rhetorical questions. Where is the wise man? Where is the scholar? Where is the philosopher of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God the world through its wisdom did not know him, God was pleased through the foolishness of what was preached to save those who believe. Jews demand miraculous signs, and Greeks look for wisdom. Here's another verse I want you to remember. But we preach Christ crucified. And that's enough to remember. We preach Christ crucified. A stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. But to those whom God has called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ the power of God and the wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God is wiser than man's wisdom, and the weakness of God is stronger than man's strength. Remember that last verse, verse 25. What were the divisions in the church in Corinth? Some scholars have looked at what Paul writes over here in verses 10 through 12, in which he names the division. He says, I hear from some reports that I'm getting in Corinth that unbelievably, there are dissensions, divisions among you. And there's quarreling among you. Some of you say, I belong to Paul. Others say, well, I follow Apollos. Others say, I follow Cephas or Simon Peter. I follow Paul. Some have said, well, that probably represented the Gentile Christians. Paul was the apostle to the Gentiles. And in starting this church was predominantly a Gentile church in Corinth. Those who had been converted from who knows what. All kinds of religions in Corinth and in most other Greek cities of that day. So to say I follow Paul may have been the Gentile faction of the church. Those who had been nothing prior to Paul's preaching. Others said, I follow Apollos. Apollos represents maybe the intellectual faction of the church. And there's always that. There's always it seems, a tension between the heart religion of the church and head religion in the church. Heart religion, head religion. Intellectual religion as opposed to feeling religion. An experiential kind of religion. What usually happens with church movements, they start out with a heart feeling. John Wesley said in his own conversion experience in 1738, I felt my heart strangely warm. I felt my heart strangely warm. I knew the presence of the Holy Spirit with me, within me. And I knew, at that point, I knew that Christ had died for my sins. I knew that Christ died for the sins of the whole world. We all knew that, he says. But now I knew him personally. I had him here, not just up here. It was not just something I had read about. It was not something I just knew in my head. I had learned about. Now I had experienced that presence. It's what John Wesley is saying. And for the rest of his life, he referred to heartwarming religion, heartwarming Christianity. There's a great difference between Christianity of the heart, that experience, and just something you've read about in a book. Until those two get joined together. If it's just head knowledge, there's not a lot of power there. But if it's just experience and not a lot of intellectual knowledge as well, there may be some going off on a tangent type of thing. Going off in the wrong direction even sometimes. So John Wesley felt it was gravely important that he combined the two. John Wesley was an intellectual in his own way. Wrote a lot of books. Read even more books. But it was that heartwarming experience, the presence of Christ in his heart, that made him say, now I know. Now I have, it's more than I just read about. It's something that I have experienced. Maybe that's the tension in part in Corinth. Those who follow Paul have had an experience with the living Christ. Apollos comes in with his intellectual knowledge and all of his beautiful words. He was a powerful orator and a great speaker. He had a gift for preaching, apparently. And that always attracts a following. Maybe that represents that portion of the church in Corinth. Another says, I follow Peter, Cephas. That would represent the Jewish part of the faith in Corinth. Because there were a lot of converted Jews who had grown up as Jews, now hear this new message about the Messiah has come, and believed that message, and became a part of the church. And there was always a tension between the Gentile portion of the church, those Gentiles who had been converted from other religions. Maybe they had never heard of the Hebrew Scriptures, did not know anything about Judaism, but they had been converted to Christianity under Paul's preaching and the preaching of others and the spreading of the church after Paul. There's always a tension between that group and the Jewish Christians who had grown up in the Jewish faith, who knew the law like the back of their hands, who followed the law, who studied the law, who loved the law more than anything in life. Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians were at odds throughout the first century in the early church. There was a group we talked about last week. They called them, Paul referred to them as Judaizers, who believed that in order to become a Christian, you first had to become a good Jew. And how do you do that? How do you become a Jew? You've got to study the Torah. You've got to know the law. Secondly, you have got to be circumcised. Without circumcision, you cannot become a Jew. And so Jewish Christians believed there were two steps to Christianity if you were a Jew or if you were a Gentile. You had to first convert to Judaism, then you could be a Christian. Paul said, we're going to cut out the middleman. Paul also said, we're going to cut out the cutting. Yeah. There is no need for, well, Paul did say that. Paul referred to it as mutilating the flesh, by the way. Paul said that is not necessary. You're a Gentile, you can become a Christian directly. You do not have to become a Jew and then become a Christian. No Jewish two-step. You jump right into Christianity. From Judaism, from Gentile to Christianity.
Who said that? I mean, who?
Paul.
Well, I know, but who had the other steps?
Well, Peter was the embodiment, was the symbol of that part of Christianity in the early years in the first century. The church at Jerusalem, which at that time in the first century was headed by which apostle? Oh, it wasn't headed by an apostle. Who was the head of the church in Jerusalem? Huh? Jesus' brother. Oh, yeah, James. Not James the apostle, but Jesus' brother, James, became the head of the church in Jerusalem in the first century. Those were Jews. The church in Jerusalem was Jewish church. These were Jews. Well, what were all of the apostles when Christ said, "Follow me"? They were all Jews. All 12 of them. And so the early church were Jews who had heard Christ's message and believed that he is indeed the Messiah that's been promised for 800 years by the prophets. But they were Jews first. And they remain Jews. That includes Peter. Peter becomes the symbolic, at least, head of the church, universal, not just in Jerusalem. But Peter had fantastic influence in Jerusalem and in other places, especially amongst Jews who had converted to Christianity. And there's a lot of those. Just remember that in the early days, Christianity was considered a part, a sect, S-E-C-T, of Judaism. It was not a new religion. It was a part of Judaism. And so it was for Jews. Jesus' final words, we call it the Great Commission, Matthew 28. Matthew 28. What did he say? Go therefore into all the world and preach the gospel, baptizing in my name and teaching them everything that I've taught you. In another place he says, you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem. This is the formula. You will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, in Samaria, and the uttermost parts of the world, the rest of the world. Why does he give it that order?
Because Samaria was looked down on by the Jews. They were considered to be...
But they were, who were they? They were exactly true. They were looked down upon by the Jews.
They were not Jewish.
They were not Jewish, they were half Jewish. Samaria is that section just north of Judea. If you remember your Old Testament history, and I know you do. How many tribes? Yes. My wife has picked up your saying. I'm trying to sell my motorhome, and you know, I've had a lot of people come and look at it. In fact, I think I sold it, but I would say, well, I don't think they're going to buy it. I don't think they're going to buy it. And she would say, but I bet they don't know as much about Hebrews as you do.
Bless her.
I had to go over to a shop the other day and have him check my motorhome. And I'm very impressed with this guy. I asked him a question, and he's so friendly and so helpful. And he gave me a little diagram and showed me this is this and do this and do, you know. So when I left, I said, you know, I am really impressed with that guy. He really knows everything about motorhomes and campers. And he said, yeah, but I bet he doesn't know as much about Hebrew as you do. She's been around Marcia too long.
I think that must be it.
Jack, how do you do it?
I just listen.
No, he pretends to listen.
Yeah. Anyway, how many tribes were there in the Old Testament in Israel? 12 tribes. How many tribes are in the southern? The kingdom splits. Saul unites the kingdom. King Saul, the first king. He loses favor with God and is replaced by what king? Who replaces Saul? Who's the second king in Israel? David, the great king. And for all of their history, they remember David. And they long to get back to the days of David. David expanded the borders. He united the tribes. Made it a great power in the Middle East. Lucky for David, there was a moment in the Middle Eastern development of things when there were no really superpowers in the area. And that's the golden age, when David was able to expand their borders to their greatest extent. Who followed David? His son. Solomon. Who followed Solomon?
His son.
Two sons followed Solomon, and they split the kingdom because they couldn't get along. They split the kingdom into two parts. The southern kingdom of two tribes, that becomes Judea. Jerusalem is the capital of the southern kingdom. The 10 northern tribes become Israel. They take the name that the nation always had, Israel. But that's 10 of the 12 tribes. As time goes by, it's the northern kingdom that seems to be most prone to drift away from God. It's the northern kingdom that is punished first in about 750 thereabouts, 730, 740, somewhere in that range. They are defeated by the Assyrian Empire to their north. Not the Syrian, the Assyrians. Their capital was Nineveh. They were a very fierce people that ruled by fear. When they conquered another nation, their first move was to scatter all the people of that nation around the other parts of their empire. Why would they do that?
So they would weaken them.
It would weaken them. Yeah, put a few here and a few here and scatter them all over the Assyrian Empire. Then they can't get together and rise up in rebellion against you. And so that's what they did with Israel. When they defeated Israel, they moved all of the people of Israel, except possibly the poorest of the poor, who had no power anyway, to other parts of their kingdom. So who populates the land that was Israel? Well, they bring in other people and put them in Israel. They shuffle everybody around. So what happens in Israel? As time went by, those 10 tribes, by the way, never got to come back home. Forever in history, they're known as the 10 lost tribes of Israel, because they were scattered and never got to come back and reunite. Now, the southern kingdom exists for about another 130, 40, 50 years. They are defeated first in about 597 BC. And part of the nation of southern king of Judea at that point, Judah, is scattered, taken to Babylon. They're defeated by the Babylonian Empire 150 years later. 10 years later, 587 BC, the Babylonians came back because Judah rose up in rebellion after the first defeat. And so the king came back and defeated Jerusalem, destroyed the city stone by stone, took all of the people except the poorest of the poor to Babylon in captivity. And about 50 to 60 years later, about 537 BC, a new king has conquered the Babylonian Empire, the Persians, and a new king lets the Israelites who want to go back home and rebuild their nation, rebuild the city of Jerusalem, even rebuild the wall around Jerusalem, and that's a biggie, and let them rebuild their temple. They got to go back home and reunite the kingdom. They're never very strong after that, but at least they got to go back home. Not so in the north. What happens with all the people in the north? A bunch of foreigners are moved into their land. And the people who are left there, the Israelites who are left there, begin to intermarry with all these foreigners who come in. Now that's a no-no in the Old Testament. That produces in the Jewish mind, that produces a bastard race. They're half-breeds. That's why the Jews who were purists, when they came back from Babylon in 537, read about this in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. One of the first things that they demanded was that you put away all those foreign wives that you married in Babylon. Put away all those foreign wives you married in Babylon and their children, because they are contaminating the race. They didn't do that in
What did they mean by put away?
Leave them in Babylon. If you come back to Jerusalem, leave those people in Babylon. They don't belong in Jerusalem. Divorce them, put them away. To purify the race. Well, that hadn't happened in Samaria. The capital city of the nation of Israel, before it was hauled off into captivity, was Samaria, the city of Samaria. So they became known as Samaritans. And the Jews did not like them. They would not have anything to do with them. They were as bad as Gentiles in the Jewish mind.
Even worse, maybe.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's the reason the story about the Samaritan woman, Jesus' well, is really considered to be getting out of line.
That's right. If you lived in the north, in Galilee, in Jesus' day, in New Testament times, you lived basically directly north of Jerusalem, the holy city. It was a direct line from Galilee to Jerusalem. But in order to go from Galilee to Jerusalem or Jerusalem to Galilee, they didn't go. You had to go through Samaria if you wanted to take that direct route, and it was by far the closest route. And how did they travel?
Around it.
They walked everywhere. They didn't have Santa Fe. They didn't have Union Pacific. They walked. And so to make that kind of trip, that's quite a trip. But if you were in Galilee, you would walk clear over here, cross the Jordan River, and go down the east side of the Jordan River, then cross over again at Jericho, and there's about 20 miles from Jericho up to Jerusalem, because Jericho is below sea level. Jerusalem is about 3,000 feet high, above sea level. That's a pretty steep climb in 20 miles. But you would do that rather than walk through Samaria. Wow. I love that passage, though, the story of the Samaritan woman. If you will look at that story, there's a word in there, one word in there, that I think tells the whole meaning of the story. When that story begins, it says very simply, Jesus had to go through Samaria. No, he didn't. Nobody had to go through Samaria. But Jesus had to go through Samaria. Why? Because there's a woman at a well that needs to hear his message. Jesus had to go through Samaria. He would not go around that day. I love that little word. Jesus had to go through Samaria because somebody needed him. That's why I came to Kansas, Eileen says. Because somebody was waiting for me.
We needed you.
Yes. Well, it took her a long time to come around to that, but now she thinks maybe she did need me. Took a long time. Well, that's the factions in Corinth. So Paul says, who's wise? Who's the scholar? Where is all this wisdom? What about this wisdom? He says, we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews. What does he mean by a stumbling block to Jews?
They didn't know Jesus Christ as being the Savior.
They just couldn't get their mind around this idea that Jesus of Nazareth could be the Messiah. Why couldn't they believe that?
Because they expected a king.
They expected a king, somebody with power, earthly power, to ride in and run off their enemies. In this case would be the Romans by the time Jesus comes. But there's a better reason. In the book of Deuteronomy, one of the books of the law, it says very plainly, anyone who is hanged from a tree, or simply anyone who is hanged, is accursed by God. How did Jesus die? He was hanged on a cross. And the law says, if you're hanged on a tree, or in this case on a cross, you are accursed by God. And there is no way that you could be the Messiah. There's no way that you could be God incarnate in human flesh if you hanged on a cross. That's a stumbling block in the minds of the Jew. And to this day, that's a stumbling block. Jews, it's a stumbling block to Jews. And what does he say about Greeks? Foolishness to Greeks. Foolishness to Greeks. Greeks, and he says, what else does he say? Jews look for miraculous signs. verse, what is that, 21? 22. Jews demand miraculous signs and Greeks look for wisdom. If a guy was hanged on a cross, he must not have been very wise. If his enemies triumphed over him to that degree, he must not have been very wise. The Jews, the Greeks were loved knowledge. They loved knowledge. That's where the great philosophers come from, the Jewish or the Greek nation. They were always looking for knowledge. And Jesus' teachings of humility, powerlessness, Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve. None of that made sense in the Jewish mind. It just didn't seem like intellectual wisdom. So Paul says, but we preach a very simple message. Look at all the sermons in the New Testament. Look at the sermons in Acts, in the book of Acts. What do they involve? What's in all? Every one of those sermons is basically the same outline. Very simple outline. First, they start by talking about the situation of the world, its need of a Savior. Then they talk about the prophecies of the Old Testament, how God will send a Messiah to save His people. Then they tell the story of Jesus. And they end up with Jesus on the cross. They tell the story of the cross and the resurrection from the cross. And then the promise that Jesus is going to return and take His people to be with Him. It's a very simple message, but it's all built around Jesus of Nazareth, who He is and what He taught, and the cross, the crucifixion, the sacrifice that Christ made, and the resurrection that defeated the cross, and the empty tomb. It's a very simple message. We preach Christ crucified. We don't need to preach anything else. If you'll read those sermons in the book of Acts, time after time, they follow that same simple formula. But today we're a lot smarter than that. We don't want to just pound at the cross, you know, Sunday after Sunday. We're a lot smarter than that. We preach a lot of the stuff, you know. No, not really. And I think that's a weakening of the church today. We do not concentrate on the cross as we should. Not enough. That's where Paul goes. And then he says that he closes chapter 1 with these words. Brothers and sisters, think of who you were before you became a member of the church. Think of where you came from. Think of what you were when you were called. Not many of you were wise by human standards. Not many were influential. Not many were of noble birth. Think of the 12 apostles. Paul made mention of that this morning in his sermon. When Jesus walked the shore of the Sea of Galilee and called those fishermen to come follow Him, was He calling an intellectual rabbi? Was He calling someone who had spent years studying the law? No. He was calling people from an everyday, and I think Paul was right this morning when he said a pretty humdrum kind of existence. Fish every day, market the fish in the afternoon or morning, late morning, maybe get a few hours sleep and go back and fish again at night. Day after day after day. Hard work. That's who Christ called. Who were you when Christ called you? Who were you when Christ called you?
You know, Vic, these guys didn't know who this man was. Yet they just got up and left everything behind.
Yeah. Yeah, if you look at all of the gospel accounts of Jesus calling the disciples, there's one word that is repeated over and over and over. And that one word has always made me wonder about this thing. That's the word immediately. Jesus said to Peter and Andrew, come, follow me, I'll make you fishers of men. Said the same thing to James and John, come follow me and I'll make you fishers of men. And immediately they left their nets and followed Jesus. They didn't, well, wait a minute, let me go take care of this. Let me do this. What would it mean if I followed you? What do you mean fishers of men? Immediately, they just left their nets and followed him.
And another thing too, their families. Where are they? You know?
Yeah, James and John were working alongside their father that morning, mending their nets. And immediately they got up and left Zebedee, and he's going, where are you guys going?
You sell a boat first.
You buy them books and buy them books, and they just tear off the covers. Poor Zebedee. Poor Zebedee. Left with that business all by himself. Well, Paul reminds them in Corinth, who were you before you were a Christian? That's a good note to leave our class on. Who were you before Christ called you to be his Christian follower? Yes, ma'am.
When do we ask you? We're having explored membership.
Oh, that's right. Next week we get what is it they say in television? We get preempted next week. I guess we'll be in the parlor next week. Thank you for that reminder.
It's September.
Is it September?
15th.
It's not this.
It's not this one. Okay, we'll be here next week then.
Hi there. How are you?
We don't know where we're going.
Kick us around. 15th is a membership.
September.